Well, welcome, friends, this afternoon, or this morning rather, to our third of three coffee conversations with Dr. Ron Cook and Dr. Levi Price. But guys, welcome back. Welcome back.
Thank you.
We're glad y'all are joining us today. Our conversation today is going to kind of go on ministry transition, and then on finishing strong. How do you finish well in ministry, which is of increasing concern to many people. So we'll just jump right in. Ron and Levi, I guess the first question, just thinking about y'all's really stories of each of y'all served in several different churches, and came to serve at the seminary in different chapters of your ministry. When you made that transition from one place to another, can you share a little bit about how you knew it was the right decision, how you knew it was time to move from one place to another? Because undoubtedly, both of you had other opportunities that you said no to, or stayed in a place when maybe you had another opportunity. How did you know when it was time to transition from one place to another?
I wanted to hear Levi talk here. Okay, if I'm going to lead out, I'm going to say this. I'll tell you what not to do. One time, at about the toughest time in my ministry, I got home from a convention and I ran into some pastor friends who had talked to folks out and about. And I had a lot of resumes out there. And one of my friends told me, he said, Ron, I think you put resumes in the towel dispensers at the convention. So that people could pull them out. So when I got accused of having some resumes out there, they were pulling them out of the towel dispensers at the convention. I thought, man, I need to change the way I'm operating here and doing things. But I'll lead off with that story, and then that Levi bring us back to what you should do. That's what you shouldn't do.
So a little more strategy than just broad disbursement.
There's yeah.
I'll say a couple of things here, and we put some thought into this. Every time I used to tell guys in the pastor's class, God may call you somewhere, but he also calls you away from somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And every time I moved, I knew it was time to move. And man, I can't tell you how I knew. It doesn't, as I think about it now, it doesn't seem that it was always the same.
Yeah.
But every time I made a transition, I knew it was time to move. A couple of times, there were concrete things. When I made the move to El Paso from my last church in California, I was so frustrated. We were stuck. We were having 3 services on Sunday morning and 2 Sunday schools, and we couldn't buy land. We made a deal to buy a piece of land that would give us the land and also be closer to the freeway, where people could have seen the church from the freeway. And the people voted not to do it. Yeah. And so there was a concrete thing in that particular case that was frustrating to me. When I left El Paso, I honestly felt like I just felt like they needed new leadership. Yeah. I've been there 17 years, and I honestly felt like they needed new leadership. That's just I felt like they needed a different face, a different voice. I also want to say, if I may, I made a couple of mistakes, and can I speak to that for a moment? Yeah. When I went to my second church, and if you watch the last meeting we had, I mentioned when I went to my second church, it was a mistake. I should not have gone to that church. There are reasons why. One of my mentors was the interim pastor there. He wanted me to come there. There were some other concrete reasons for considering going to that church. But it was I made a mistake. And I knew the week that I told about to come be their pastor, I knew that week that I made a mistake. But I was too young to know, if I had more experience, I would have backed off of it, go back to my church and said, it's okay if I stay here for a little bit longer. I'm serious. Yeah. It was a mistake. And I had a bad time. I explained that last time at that church. And then I went to the mission field. And I had to go to the mission field because I needed to move, get out of that church. went to mission field. And I had to go to mission field to realize that my calling was not a missionary calling.
Yeah.
My calling was a pastoral calling, not a missionary calling.
How long did you stay in that church?
I was there 3 years.
3 years.
3 years.
3 years.
And and the church did well. This is incredible. The church actually grew.
Yeah.
But I was miserable, and I almost, as I explained before, I almost left.
Mm.
Anyway, but now here's the thing I want to say: even if you make a mistake, God is a redeeming God, and He can use that mistake. And we went to mission field, and again, God blessed us. We started 8 different churches down there, and where I was when I was there. But I knew I'd be putting together a conference or something and inviting somebody in to preach. And all the time I'm thinking, I wish I was the one that was coming in to preach. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
And I realized that, and I even asked the mission board if they would let me be a pastor. If they let me be a pastor, I would stay on the field. But at that time, it was illegal in Mexico to have a foreigner as a pastor.
Yeah.
And so they would not let me
Wow.
be a pastor. Anyway, but here's the thing I want to say: God is a redeeming God. And listen, had I not gone to Mexico, had I not learned to speak Spanish and learned to deal with Hispanic people, I don't think they would ever call me to be pastor at El Paso. El Paso is a Hispanic town, 80% Hispanic, and you just about have to speak at least some Spanish to get along in El Paso. And so even though you make a mistake, God's a redeeming God, and He can straighten that stuff out.
Yeah.
So I've talked too long, but that's basically what I'd like to say to start something.
I remember you told us in class that God calls you, and sometimes God will call you away. And I didn't believe it. I mean, really, you hear that, but until you experience, it's much more common to experience a call to a place. And my 8th year in Marble Falls, I haven't told Marble Falls this, so if my Marble Falls friends are watching, this is another piece of that story. 6-8 months, somewhere in there before we left, I started to sense that, and it broke my heart. It was not my will. And there were no opportunities either on the horizon. And so it took a while to work through that. And it was one of the bigger shocks of my life that sent me to a little bit of a calling spiral to resign and feel relief, not sadness. Now, there was no comment on the love of my people and my church there that still is home for us in many ways. But you felt God's presence in that, calling you away and calling you to at that point to come here to Truett. And that was, I think that's true. Not every time is it just like that, I think, but certainly was my experience. But Ron, what about you?
Well, it's such a mystery about how God makes good matches. I am intrigued by it. I'm just fascinated by congregational life and by pastors. I get frustrated at the bad matches, and we see a lot of them. And I wish I could better understand why that's happening more. I do think we're seeing more bad matches. I don't know, maybe not, Levi. Anyway, that may be I'm not sure about that. I see more bad matches. Maybe I know it going in. I'll see somebody and I'll think, man, that looks like a train wreck, and wish I could say something, and maybe I should sometimes. But on the real human level, I think there are 2 reasons I've seen why God brings a pastor to a church. I think that's important to know to talk about leaving and going. And one is for a church to become more whole. That's the internal reason. And there's an external reason that a church will have more impact. God really intends for the church to have what I call centripetal power, salt and light to a community, and centrifugal power, the force to share the gospel and love of Christ to transform our world. And for a pastor to lead a church to have impact, it's those 2 things: to become more whole and be more impactful. Now, that's just a real human view, and I'm using human language. And so why does God call somebody? I've had to understand that to go ask why God led me into a church that had a pathological level of division, and just almost gonna have conflict no matter what. Why? Well, God intends for the church to be whole.
Yeah.
And in the process of God using pastors, and you can, I've heard pastors say, I had to bring healing to a church. There was a lot of chaos that had to settle down. There was division. There are differences of opinion. However, it manifests itself. God wants his church to be whole. And some pastors are led to churches to become whole. And I actually think both. And I don't think you have to wait for the church to be whole to lead the church to have impact. You didn't in El Paso, your church began growing the day you showed up, Levi. So it was growing the whole time you were there. So you don't have to wait. So then I was asking a moment ago about a scripture. I think if God has led you to a church to be more whole, you've got to listen to James 1:4 and let your steadfastness have its full effect.
Mm.
If you have a sense that your time there has had the effect that God intended through you, whatever it is, I think there's a real peace and resolve in that. And I think that's something, I've heard pastors say, God gave me peace to leave, God brought healing, whatever, but I think that's what's happening in my human understanding, is that God has brought a level of wholeness to the congregation. So that, that's one thing I'd say. And maybe in our conversation, we'll talk more. I think there on the other side, Levi's talked about that. Maybe I'll hold that. We might talk about what is it that you might sense down the way. And I'll hold that right now. I don't want to keep talking.
Could I add something? I don't know if you remember, but in my leadership class, I used to give out this different kinds of pastoral leadership thing. And I never did realize till I came to seminary, and I've said this in class, anybody that had me in class knows this, I never did realize every church that I went to after they'd gone through a real problem, a split, a problem with the pastor, they fired a pastor, something. Every church I went to was that. And one of those leadership roles in there was something about rebuilding. And every one of them, when you think about this, every church you went to was in that kind of situation, Then you realize this is something about who you are. And so I think being called to a church would be, is who I am a fit for their needs? Is who I am a fit for their needs? And so that we got to look deeper than ourselves to see that and know that. See, I did not realize it, but everyone I went to was in trouble. They'd run a pastor off, they'd had a split, that sort of thing. And we were able to, and I say we, I probably should say God, but I kind of think like God does it in partnership with us. So together, we were able to bring peace to those congregations. That's what you were talking about, and to move ahead. But it does have something to do with who we are. Who we are as an individual, who we are as a pastor.
Well, ideally, it should be this way. If we could get better at helping people understand who they are as pastors, I think that's critical. I think I just said it all right there. That's why I came on this podcast.
Come on now.
I get to it's the bedrock reality, Levi, and it's just the truth. The church that is considering you. I had, the best move, the clearest move that I ever made. I talked with the church a year before I went and said, I don't feel led. They came back around. So that happened with you at El Paso. And the first time around is, well, we just heard things and we think you'd be a good pastor of our church. A year later, Donna Burney, who's an adjunct professor at Baylor right now. She was Donna Maples at that time, but Donna, professor at Howard Payne, called me back and I said, what makes you think I need to become pastor of your church? And she read me my profile.
Wow.
She said, because of this and this and this and this and this. Not only had I come to a better understanding of who I was. And some of that had come through negotiation. Levi, you talked about going back and forth with El Paso because they need to adjust. If I'm going to be your pastor, there's some adjustments to get ready for me that you need to make or whatever. And boy, I tell you, when you hear that, there's this drawing you think, boy, I mean, it just gets clear. And that's the best
Yeah.
step I ever
Yeah.
made. That's how it happened. And it, so but that's ideal. That hasn't happened
Yeah.
all along the way with me.
That's where Donnie Iverson said he was the best pastor he'd ever had.
Yeah.
Well,
And that's for young pastors, that's the difficulty right out of seminary.
Yeah.
You know some about yourself, but you haven't really been tested fully yet and developed. And you just need a job. You can't always just find the one that suits you best. Some of that is learned over time, but hopefully we all continue to grow and continue to learn even through that. That's interesting. Well, what we're facing right now is a wave of retirements. They're calling this the Great Resignation period across industries post-COVID, but certainly retirements that were either delayed during COVID or sped up because of COVID, and just because of the baby boomer generation. We just have a huge number of pastors who stayed a little longer in ministry than maybe others have before, that are retiring, and others considering it. So thinking about that, it's not the last stage of ministry, but generally that's a big step to take. How did you both know it was time to retire? Because I'm sure there's a lot of feelings go into that, a lot of, I haven't been through it, so I won't speak into that, but it's a big decision for you and your family and everybody. When did y'all know it was time to retire, and how did that come about?
I believe I was going first this time. I'm listening.
Yeah, I'd like to. I talk about that because I back up this.
Sure, of course.
When I came to the seminary, in the year 2000, I had this subdural hematoma, and I got meningitis in the hospital. Y'all know the story. I was out virtually for a year, and Dick Beckles, dear friend, passed away this recently, but Dick had been pastor at El Paso before, and he was at the state office at that time. He literally blocked everything off, and he was like the interim pastor during that time while I was in the hospital. So, that had an effect on me. So when Paul, I didn't come to seminary like everybody else. I had some problems with Southern faculty initially because I didn't come like everybody else. Paul brought me, period. And you're smiling, but that's true.
Well,
Paul brought me here. That's exactly what happened. But when he called me and he said, he called me and he says, I figured he was asking for money. Paul, I figured he was asking for money.
For those not related to Truett, this is Dean Paul Powell, who was an incredible fundraiser and the dean of Truett for 8 years, something like that, early 2000s, and a pretty legendary figure in his own right.
He really was. But anyway, and I've known Paul for a long time. But anyway, he called and I said, what do you want, Paul? I figured he wanted money. He said, Levi, I want you to come to seminary and teach seminary students how to be pastors in the real world. And that really hit me, because I had just gone through this terrible thing when I almost died. And I was wondering how it's been the rest of my time. And so, physical things and everything else played into that. Plus, at that time in my life, I thought was if I can make a difference in a whole class of pastors, that's a way to multiply your ministry. So I just wanted to throw that into that part. Again, when it came time for me to retire from seminary, I just knew it's time to retire. And I went in the office. I was sitting there at breakfast one morning with Lou, my wife. I was 67 at that time. And I said, I'm going to retire. David Garland was he was associate dean and then dean, but he was the one that actually ran the seminary during those years. And David was the one that he had told me, said you stay as long as you want to, But so I went in and I told David, I said, David, I'm ready to retire. But he said, oh goodness, you're not the one I wanted to retire.
Yeah, it was me. He wanted,
No, it wasn't
me
you.
to retire.
It wasn't you, and I'm not going to say who it was, but I know who it was. But anyway, and so I retired, but then they turned around and asked me to keep teaching as an adjunct. So I did Actually, for several years, I taught as adjunct. Here, I wasn't on the faculty anymore, but I did come in and teach classes. Anyway, it's very difficult for me to explain exactly why, but just like in these other cases, and when I finally went in and told Terry York, who was the associate dean, when I stopped teaching, when I finally went in and told Terry York, I said, all right, it's time to get somebody younger. I really felt like, man, that I needed somebody younger. I found myself bringing people into my class who were younger pastors, so that they could communicate with the students. It wasn't that I didn't feel like I could still teach them something. A lot of the students thought I was too old to teach them something. I felt like that. And so sometimes it's a concrete thing. Sometimes it's more of a, I just know it's time kind of thing. That's for me. And, I've always done the thing I thought was the right thing to do. That's really the bottom line.
That's helpful.
There's Levi's just once again summed it up. I mean, it's there's an old adage that you will know, and that's true. You will know. Matt, I want to be careful here. I found myself today wanting to be careful because everybody's life is so different, and these are really, really sensitive things. I do think I see a lot of hanging on going on. And that's not pretty. I didn't want to be in that mode. I know that. And I knew that early on. And I know a lot of people feel that way. And quite frankly, I mean, this is insensitive and probably not wise to say. I see more of that in academic circles than I do in pastoral life. And, there are younger people who really need the opportunity to serve. I know that. And I sense some of what Levi said there, that you start thinking who really needs to be doing this. So those are factors. But for me, this, Matt, I mean, for the last 5 years, I saw another chapter. I just think in our calling, I really didn't see my retirement. I saw my retirement as a retirement from full-time responsibility. But I saw another chapter. I think that and one other thing were the biggest factors. Levi and Lou have gone through quite a crisis. I'm about to allude to Sarah's cancer, but I'll tell you what, when the one you shared life with goes through something, it really does change you. And not only could I see another chapter, but I realized whatever time I had left, I tell you what, when God matches you in life and ministry with just an ideal person, I married the happiest girl in the world. I really did. I mean, she is the happiest girl on the planet. And Sarah doesn't mind if I call her a girl. I get away with that. She lets me know she's the boss and she's the woman of the house, so I don't have to worry about that. But just more time with her was a factor that there was more to life. But this other chapter of ministry really pulled me forward. Bottom line, I didn't know what in the world that would be, but I had a sense. I didn't know if I was going to go down with, I admire Matt Snowden as much as any pastor on this earth. I love him to death. And I thought, well, if I just need to go down and say, Matt, what do you need me to do? Whatever that chapter is, as it turned out, there was another opportunity. So, but I just saw another chapter, and I think that's important. This calling doesn't stop. It has stopped for Levi. Obviously, he pastored through the pandemic, which I didn't do.
Well, we'll turn to that in a minute. You said there's a lot of hanging on going on. And, we've worked in the last several years here with a few thousand churches, I guess, in transition, several hundred a year over 6 years, 6.5. And, there's been a few people that made bad mistakes and did a lot of damage. A few pastors that had major personal struggles that caused a lot of conflict and damage in the church. But the most common call we get in our placement office is things were going well 4 or 5 years ago. And then the pastor stayed a little too long, and maybe it's to get the kids through high school or college or for lack of opportunity, or you needed to get to retirement age. And It's difficult when you're in it, but at any stage, we have to be faithful to know when to go and know when to leave. And that's a really tough thing. And I would say the stereotype is that pastors are pretty bad at retirement. We can be some really unhappy folks when we lose a lot of that being at the center of things and that pulpit to preach and our call. I mean, that's a complicated thing. So it's helpful to hear that. And you guys, I'll reference it this way. Y'all said it more positively. Y'all been pretty bad at retirement. Y'all came out of that pretty quick. So in a time when if you wanted to, you could do any number of things or not do any number of things. You all have kept serving the church well and faithfully. And Ron kind of started us off on saying there was calling to something. What has led you to keep doing interims, Levi, and to keep serving a church, not full time, but quite a bit of the time? What has led you on? What does that look like for you in this stage of life? Okay. How many interims have you done? Any idea?
2021, something like
Okay,
that.
yeah.
It's really a loaded question. So I want to say one thing that he mentioned, Sarah, is a great, a lot of us in the ministry, and the three of us included, there's nothing in the world like a pastor's wife or pastor's spouse. Nothing in the world like a real pastor's wife. And Sarah's a great one. I'm a great one. You know, you've married a great one. There's just nothing in the world like a real pastor's wife. That's just how it's good. So I just wanted to throw that in. You know, it all goes back to the calling and to who we are. And you know, I came to seminary, but I still had this desire to be a pastor. And so I wanted to preach, but it was more to it than preaching. And so, you know, I began to take interims at that particular time and go be interim somewhere. And then because I was teaching life work as a pastor, I took the course for the intentional interim. At the time, I really didn't plan to be an intentional interim. You and I we took a basic course together.
We took the first one together.
And then I went on and took the intentional interim because I was thinking if I'm going to teach pastors, I need to know what's going on with this thing. And then I started taking on some what we call traditional interims and some intentional interims. And the ones that I've done since I've been completely out have been intentional interims. But anyway, there's a process you go through with that and everything. And I don't know, once again, it goes back to who you are. It's part of who you are.
Yeah.
And the last one, you know, I worked with a church here in town and they asked me to come help them figure out how to die, which was really, really hard, really hard. And so we got that figured out and we did well. It's a long story, I don't need to tell it, but we got it figured out. We did it well. And then after that, I just told a couple of churches, I'm burned out or I don't want to do it for a while. So I went for a couple of years with that. But just like you're talking about going to see Matt. So I'm in Dr. Patterson's class over at the First Baptist Church. You know, I went because I wanted to gain some of his wisdom, you know. And I'm in his class. And so when he retired because of health reasons, they asked me if I'd take over, and I took over that class. So I taught that class for 2 years. What it did is it gave me the opportunity to do some pastoral work, you understand, and all this. And then this thing came up over at Clifton where I'm now, and I went ahead and prayed about it and took it on. Ron and I have talked about this. We're good friends. If I'd have known the pandemic was coming, I don't know what I would have done or not. Jerry Smith pastored there for 32 plus years, and Jerry was also a good friend, a very good friend. And So I took, and that's where I've been this last time.
Yeah.
The only thing I can really say is, even working here at the seminary, and there's a way you do pastor while you're with the seminary profession and your work and all this. But even working here at the seminary, I didn't get the fulfillment I got with working with the congregation. And so I just continued to do that. I don't really have a concrete reason for that. And they keep, people would invite me and I would go and talk about it and end up being interim pastor here and there. So they've all been unique experiences, every one of them. This last one's been harder, mainly because of the pandemic. It made it very difficult. But we're coming out of that now. I hope we're coming out of the pandemic. I hope we are. But the church is coming out of it at least. And the church is doing pretty well right now in the circumstances. So I do think that the more interims you do, the more you learn about what's right and wrong about, and you do that work now. So you learn more about what's right and wrong about doing it.
Very different thing than pastoring.
It's different. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a real good answer on that, but that's the best I can do.
But it sounds like it's love of the church, not just a sense of obligation or boredom that keeps you coming out. Because
it's not boredom, because frankly, I could be bored. It's not good, but a little bored.
A little more bored in life, huh?
All right, your turn. Your turn. I'm
I'm
sorry.
gonna use that, Levi.
I've been blown the whole
Take
thing.
some more, no, my goodness, no, I can take some more boredom, boy, I'm gonna use that one. This week has been a busy week, so I could have used a little more. Oh, excuse me, I'm sounding like I'm complaining about being here. I'm not, I'm loving this. It's a love, my goodness, I really missed congregational ministry. I loved my time at Truett, but my first calling, and what I love the most is pastoral work in its various roles, various aspects of pastoral work in the midst of the congregation. And I love listening and studying. I love theology, love reading theology, and but I would tease my theologian friends. There's only one real ecclesiology. And that's a flesh and blood reality of the body of Christ. And to study it, understand it, to live among it, to serve among it as the body of Christ is, Levi mentioned the highs. The joy of really doing what you love the most is it's almost indescribable to someone. Because we hear so many stories, and we've talked about them here, about how difficult the pastorate can be. We neglect to talk about the joys and the celebration, the immense meaning. I cannot, I don't mean to overly dramatize it. I really don't, but I can't imagine anybody having a more meaningful life than being among the people of the congregation. In my role now, it's more of a discipleship and training role. I'm working alongside Dr. Paul Sands at First Baptist Woodway. He has a seminary-like training institute for his teachers and leaders, and so he needed somebody to direct and help him teach it. So we work together in that. To watch, I've realized watching lay people who are so bright, so brilliant. I've got people sitting in me as brilliant, maybe more so than seminary students I taught, and we had some brilliant students in this school. To watch them begin to learn and integrate and grow, it is just thrilling to see. So what a joy to be able to do it. I don't know how long, Paul has my resignation letter out there in his desk. Anytime he needs me to sign it at First Woodway, he can cut me loose anytime he needs to. I gave him that from day one, just figuratively that's a reality. But it is so good. And I looked forward to that. I really did. And I still do. I don't know what else is out there. I could use a little more boredom sometimes. So, and I haven't pastored through a pandemic either. If you had that conversation, I'd have to shut up and listen. Levi's pastored during a pandemic. I've just kind of sat there and encouraged and watched it. It's a different time. So anyway.
Well, that's such an encouragement. I know to me, and I hope to those watching, there are so many leaving negatively from ministry or leaving with conflict. And there is so much press about the negative stories of ministry, and the conflict presses in upon us too. To have good examples of vitality and vibrancy over a long term and a deep love of the church that carries throughout life. I mean, that's just very encouraging for all of us, and hopefully encouraging to those considering retirement, thinking about what is that next stage, that there is a next thing to go through. There's ministry to be done throughout. I know when my grandmother, who was not a minister, but layperson at First Baptist Longview, she couldn't do much toward the end of her life, died of pancreatic cancer about 6.5 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that. But even when she couldn't do much of anything, we had to have the crochet basket next to her bed because she was going to make baby blankets for their pregnancy crisis center. And she was going to do that to the end. I mean, Mama was going to go down swinging for the kingdom,
Wow.
And I think of that all too often. Boy, don't you want your call to carry you through to love the church more deeply, to serve in whatever way you can, at whatever season, for as long as you can, and to see y'all's evident love of that it's really encouraging for us.
Yeah.
So to bring this kind of full back to the first question of our first conversation was about some of y'all's call journey. At this stage, how are you understanding your calling? That calling that drew you into this, that calling that has sustained you through some of this. We talked about in our last conversation, the call that helps you hang in there when you'd almost rather do anything but. How do you understand your calling in this stage of life? And I'll just leave it there. 50 years later or so.
Well, gosh, Matt, I guess because I don't know, I didn't have the ambiguity. One of my struggles when I first came to seminary is that I expected so many of the students to have the same sense of their calling as I had. And my students had to teach me that God works with different people in different ways. Just hearing Levi today talk about how God used him, formed him, shaped him, took him to the mission field back in the pastorate. I mean, that was a God's Levi Price journey of getting Levi ready for what God wanted him to do down the way. And so there's not just one way, it's all unique. But when I was called, I mean, it was just real simple. Called me to be a pastor. And that including the proclamation, the caring, the call to congregational life. So that's one thing but I think amidst and at the center of that, I would need to go deeper, but I don't need to do that now. But let me just say this: when I knew God put a claim on my life to serve Him, and I knew that I was being called by God to do whatever God wanted me to do. I mean, how do you possibly? What greater thing is there? I mean, you're called to serve.
Yeah.
And, you show up to serve and God opens doors. I've heard that all my life. People make fun of it because it sounds so simplistic. But, you're called to serve and doors open and you walk through. I mean, and it's just, it's so deeply meaningful to know that, that's all I really am.
Yeah.
My philosophy of ministry came from an old turpentine farmer in Georgia, Waldo Woodcock, who was the discipleship training director of the state of Georgia when I went to pastor in suburban Atlanta. And he came in one day to see me. I was his new pastor, and he said, "What's your philosophy of ministry?" Well, I'd just written this really good paper in PhD work. Some of them wrote a philosophy of teaching. I wrote a philosophy of pastoral ministry, and I had it in my files, and I still remembered some of it. So I just kind of summarized it. And he sat there and just beamed, and I thought, boy, am I really something to be able to talk to Waldo Woodcock about my philosophy of ministry? Am I not something? He said, "Pastor, that might be the best thing I've ever heard." And boy, was I full of myself. And so I sat there and I said, "Well, Levi, or Waldo, Waldo Woodcock, Waldo, what is your philosophy of ministry?" And they said, oh, Pastor, all I do is give God a chance to work. I almost didn't breathe as he was walking out of the room.
Yeah.
I literally reached in my file and tore that paper in half. And that's been my philosophy of ministry from that day. That's been it. You know, what better thing is there?
Yeah.
Than to just say, you know, I'm a servant. And, you know, I'm your servant. You know, it's that Samuel.
Yeah.
Wow.
Reality, isn't it, Levi?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, it's just at the core of who you are. And so.
That's a good word.
And you got a key there. My first church, you know, I was seminary student, pastoring this church, and we had some kind of banquet. I asked one of the professors from seminary to come over and speak to our church that night. And he came over, we had a banquet, whatever. Everybody was having fun. It was a good night. And he looked around and said, boy, you're doing a good job there. And I said, you know, I don't know that I'm doing anything here. And he said, well, at least you're not getting in the way. That may be the negative part of what you're saying. At least you're not getting in the way. That may be a target. I may get emotional too, I'm sorry, but you know, I gave my life to Christ. I was in the Marine Corps, and pretty soon began to feel the calling to go to seminary and prepare, you know, and it was always for me to be a pastor. I had a young man who was in the youth group in the church we were involved with. And he said, so you're going to seminary? And I said, yes, I am. And he said, what are you going to do? You got to just be a pastor? And you know, that really hit me. What do you mean just be a pastor? You know? Yeah. Because I think it was a calling to be a pastor from the beginning. You know? And so I said, yeah, I've got to study and pray to be a pastor, whatever. And I had opportunities at that point. Before I went to the Marine Corps, I worked for a contractor in California, very successful contractor. He offered me a partnership in his company to come back and work for him. I made captain in the Marine Corps for 2 years as an officer. 2 years. It was unheard of. I mean, it was the Vietnam thing, and they were really scrounging for company grade officers. I made captain in the Marine Corps, making more money than I ever made in my life, you know, as a captain in the Marine Corps. And there was a future in the Marine Corps. I identified to stay in the Marine Corps. In the future, I'd have to go back to Vietnam once or maybe twice, but there was a future in the Marine Corps. And you know, Lou and I prayed about it, and he said, no, the Lord's calling us to ministry. We got to go that direction. See, I can tell you today, there have been times when I said, oh, I wish I stayed in the Marine Corps. I could retire, maybe as a lieutenant colonel, I had a great retirement, you know. And there have been times when I said, you know, if I'd have gone to back to work for Logan, we probably would have had a lot more money we've had, a lot more stuff that we had. But the truth is, Ron, you understand this? I wouldn't trade my life for anything. That's the truth.
Amen.
Amen.
Sorry.
You got to know this about pastors. Not a lot of us cry outside of speaking, but most of us get our cries in when we speak. That's when it all comes up for whatever reason. And that means it's genuine. There's good emotion there. It is. I mean, what a life to live when people name their kids after you, and you're the first one to see people's babies, and you're the last one to pray with them when they die, and you're there at their marriages and every point in between. Once you get a taste of that, and if you like it, and it feels right, there's just not much else you can do that feels as full as that. And you leave certainly legacy that just ripples out and out. But this has been a wonderful 3 conversations. I've enjoyed it. I think it's going to be a great encouragement to many that watch. I know it's something I'll probably listen to again and again, and it's just a personal treasure for me to be able to sit with you all and visit. Thank you for your stories. Thank you for your life. For me, thank you for your ministries that have affected me and my family, and the many others that have watched and will watch. We appreciate it. And it sounds like, you know, in the Bible, Old Testament, you're really just getting started at about 80 for a lot of those Old Testament characters, and y'all may not quite be there yet. So we may have a whole other, we can do this maybe in another 20 years and see what y'all have done in ministry at that point and have another fun conversation. But thank you all for tuning in today. Have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.